G'day folks, thanks for joining me here at week number 15 of our Chronological Bible-in-a-Year reading challenge. A very pivotal week this week as we continue through the book of Samuel and see Israel's transition from a nation led by judges to a kingdom led by kings. Really pivotal point in the story. We're also going to be reading 7 of David's Psalms that he apparently wrote during this period to give you another angle on the story. It's going to be a great week, but until then, sit back, relax and enjoy today's tutorial.
Last week you should have read the books of Judges and Ruth, which I described as bridging books between the age of, or the Joshua generation, the people that came into the promised land, and the onset of the kingdom. And it is that onset of the kingdom, the establishment of Israel as a kingdom, one family became one nation, is now about to become one kingdom. That is the period of time that we're reading this week as we read 1 Samuel chapter 4 to 24, and we're also going to read 7 of David's Psalms. The reason we're looking at David's Psalms is because these are 7 Psalms he apparently wrote in this period of time. So please read them. It's going to help you to really appreciate these Psalms when you are focused on the context into which they're written. And again, that's the whole reason we're doing the Bible here in chronological order, reading things as they happened, because it helps to give our mind the context into which things are written, which obviously helps with our hermeneutics. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview on 1 and 2 Samuel in a moment, and then we're going to look at the 2 characters, Saul and Samuel. 1 and 2 Samuel were actually written originally as one book, and they weren't split until about 200 to 300 BC when the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, was put into the Greek language. So this happened with Samuel. It happened with the books of Kings, Chronicles, and Ezra and Nehemiah. That was actually, they also were written originally as one book and then split when the Bible was put into Greek. 1 and 2 Samuel cover a period of just over 100 years, okay? And it was written around, or describes a period of time in approximately 1000 BC. So 3000 years old. That's how old these stories are in what archaeologists call the Iron Age in the whole scope of human history. Okay? The main character of 1 and 2 Samuel is actually David. In fact, I think you could probably call the books 1 and 2 David. I mean, he really is the main character in them. But in these opening chapters of 1 Samuel, I'm going to focus my attention on this video today on the prophet Samuel and the first king of Israel, King Saul. So we're going to look at those 2 characters just now. Samuel is a major character in Israel's history, and as we read his story this week, I want you to pay attention to how similar his story is to that of Moses and even Jesus. Okay? Like Moses, we learn about his birth, we learn something about his childhood, his first encounter with God and how God spoke to him. Okay, we see his burning bush experience, as it were. He has a final departing speech that he gives to Israel, which is kind of similar to Moses's, and then he dies and the whole of Israel mourn for him. He's also similar to Jesus, and this is really obvious. His mum sings a prophetic song about him, which is very similar to what Mary does when Jesus is born. And not only that, but there is a verse in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, verse 26, that says, "The boy Moses grew in stature and in favor with God and with man." And that verse is directly quoted speaking about Jesus in Luke chapter 2 in the 1st century, which begs the question, what does Samuel have in common with Moses and Jesus? And I think the answer to that is summed up in one word: transition. Samuel, like Moses and Jesus, is responsible for overseeing a major shift, a major transition in Israel's history. And it has to do with the way that Israel primarily is governed. So Moses was a transitional leader. He oversaw the nation of Israel, the 12 tribes, the family of Israel becoming a nation under a new law. Okay, Moses oversaw that transition. Jesus, in the other end of history, oversees the transition of Israel becoming a physical entity to becoming a spiritual entity under a spiritual king in a spiritual kingdom. So these are 2 major transitional figures. Samuel is the same. He is entrusted with overseeing the transition of God's people from being led by judges to being led by a monarchy, led by a king. And we see this start to happen in chapter 8. Samuel is the last of Israel's judges, all right? And he's doing what all the judges in the book of Judges has been doing. He's leading God's people, prophesying, military campaigns, etc., etc. But then in chapter 8, he does something that none of the other judges did. He decides to appoint his sons as his successors, as his sons to succeed him in his leadership. And they do a terrible job. They're a bad choice, and everyone goes, this is no good. We don't want these guys. But what it does is it gives a thought to the God's people, and they say, we actually like this idea. We like the idea of having a national leader where there is a guaranteed successor after him. And so they come to Samuel and they say, listen, we like this system of government. We want you to give us a monarchy. We want to establish a form of government where we will always be guaranteed a leader on the throne. Okay? So they asked for a king, no longer trusting God to give them the leader that they needed when they needed him, no longer trusting God to give them what they needed. No. Now they would have a system that they could trust. Now they could trust in the state to give them the leaders, perpetually give them leaders. And so Samuel, even though he knows this grieves the heart of God, even though in chapter 12 he calls it an evil thing that they did, he goes to God and God says, go for it, mate. Transition God's people, transition Israel into a monarchical system. And this is no surprise to us. After all, remember, Moses had prophesied this would happen, all right, in Deuteronomy 17, 350 years earlier. Moses said this is what God's people are going to do. So anyway, we have this transition from the system of the judges where God would supernaturally appoint people as they needed them to a monarchy where the system would always guarantee a national leader would be in charge of God's people. And when he dies in chapter 25, the whole nation mourns for him. He is the last of God's judges. His life is not recorded in the book of Judges where there's 12 judges. He was not one of the 12, but he was greater than the 12. He was a judge like Moses or a judge like Joshua who had national influence over all the tribes and who transitioned God's people into a whole new form of governance, which is where we come to the character, King Saul. We're introduced to him and things start off for King Saul really well. He's a donkey farmer. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. Samuel anoints him. God tells him to anoint him. Okay, so he is absolutely God's choice. He wins his first military battle and all of Israel support him in his leadership. And then within a very quick spate of time, after Samuel hands over the leadership to Saul and says, you're now in charge, mate, Saul disobeys God, and Samuel comes to him as a prophet now, not with political power, but with prophetic power, and says, listen, Saul, God's now going to take the kingdom from you. So God finally appoints a king, and it doesn't last long. And from there on, we're introduced to David. And the whole rest of 1 Samuel, okay, all the way up to chapter 31 or whatever it is devoted to a contrast between David and Saul. David and Saul, David and Saul. David is kind, whereas Saul is cruel. David is humble, whereas Saul is arrogant. David is a man after God's heart. Saul only looks out for his own interests. Okay, we see this constant contrast, which kind of begs the question, if God knew he was going to appoint David as king in the line of Judah, which is what Genesis 49 told us, the tribe of Judah would always be the one holding the leadership scepter in their hand, okay? Israel prophesied that over his son Judah way back hundreds of years earlier. Why did God bother with King Saul? Why did God bother with King Saul if it was only going to last a few years? And I have two answers to that question before I sum up. I think there is an immediate reason that God chose King Saul. Saul came from the smallest clan of the smallest tribe, the despised tribe of Benjamin. Do you remember the end of the book of Judges? Israel had a civil war where they ganged up on Benjamin and almost wiped out that whole tribe because of the rape that took place. Okay, Saul came from that tribe, the least likely tribe for a ruler to be chosen. And I think the reason that God chose that tribe was, number one, out of his grace, just showing this really is God's choice, but also because there would be no suspicion of any political agenda. And the whole of Israel knew that Benjamin was weak, and there was no way Benjamin could rise up and dominate the rest of the tribes. If God had chosen a leader from another tribe, there would always be the suspicion of, is this tribe trying to dominate the rest of us? But for Benjamin, they knew that would not be the case. So I believe that actually helped God's people rally towards King Saul, knowing that his tribe was the weakest, and therefore we can trust he is God's choice. I think that's probably one of the reasons God chose him immediately. But there's also a bigger picture of why God chose King Saul before handing the kingdom over to David from the tribe of Judah. And it's simply this. All the way from the start of the book, Genesis, with Cain and Abel, and all the way through the era of the patriarchs, we've seen this theme highlighted where the older brother persecutes the younger. Do you remember me saying this again and again as we went through Genesis? The older persecutes the younger. The older seeks to destroy the younger. This is a theme that goes all the way through to the 1st century when the Jews tried to destroy the Christians in the book of Acts. God knows and God declares the end all the way from the beginning. And I believe God wanted this thread to continue all the way through the scripture so we could watch the way that King Saul tried to kill David, and it would be yet another reminder, prophetic picture into the future of what the old order in the 1st century would do to the new order of God's people. So I believe there's that thematic reason that God anointed King Saul, even though it was only going to be for a short period of time. And the second reason, in the long-term view of things, is that, you know what? Here's the truth of it. In life, God, or just life itself, gives us both good examples and bad examples to learn from. Saul was a bad leader for many reasons. And again, many people have taught on the contrast of the leadership style of Saul and David. They're really valuable, really valuable leadership lessons can be found there. And that's what life does. That's what God does. We get good examples to learn from, and we get bad examples to learn from. We've got good governments to learn from, bad governments. We have good parents, some of us have bad parents. But we can learn from all of them. And I think that's another reason that God gave. He wants to contrast Saul with David so we can learn the lessons of what a good king looks like. Anyway, that's just my theory. To sum up, the book of Samuel, the main reason of 1 Samuel, and you're only reading the first 24 chapters this week, but the whole purpose of the book of 1 Samuel anyway, is to highlight two major transitions. The transition of God's people from being led by judges that God gave when they needed them, transitioning into a system of government that was a monarchy, where there would always be a king on the throne. That is a major transition that takes place. The second transition is the transition from King Saul to King David. And you're going to be reading about that this week, and we'll look at that more next week, where King Saul, a bad king, transitions to King David, a good king, and we see the contrasts between the two. Don't also forget to read those 7 Psalms of David. As I said, reading them in context is really going to help you and help you understand and appreciate those Psalms more. Bless you guys. Stay warm this week, okay? And I'll see you on the other side as we continue from 1st into 2nd Samuel, and David begins to take begins to take the kingdom on. Anyway, that's enough from me. Bless you guys, and enjoy your readings. Bye.
That's it for today's lesson. I really hope you enjoy your readings this week. Remember, allow yourself time to read as much as you can in one sitting. Don't get lost in the detail. Just keep going and watch the Bible's big story unfold before you. Remember also to hit me up on our social media channels or website, and I'll see you next time.